So to make this really clear again, what's our problem here? The problem is that in bigger apps where we have a lot of widgets, and of course potentially way more widgets than I have here on this slide, when some child widget needs some data, we typically have to manage that data in our topmost widget, in the My App widget here, because different places of the app need the data, and therefore we have to use the common denominator so that we can pass data through the constructors of widgets, because that is how we typically distribute values or data right now. We pass them as arguments to our widgets, and that can lead to very long chains of here's an argument, please forward it, here's an argument, please forward it, where we pass data through widgets that don't care about it just because some child widget cares. And that's a problem we want to fix with state management, because it can be cumbersome and difficult to pass data through constructors, and besides that extra hassle as a developer, which we don't want to have, it can also impact our application performance. Because if we manage everything in the main Dart file and there in our main widget, or in a couple of root widgets, then these widgets rebuild whenever anything in that data changes, and therefore the entire widget tree rebuilds, even if only one small child widget somewhere in the tree is really interested in the updated data. Take our navigation example from the previous sections, where we built our Meals app with some extra navigation in there. We're managing all our meals data, and that includes things like which are the favorites of the user and which filters did the user set. All that data is managed here in the main Dart file. And the downside is that in here, we basically rebuild all widgets which we render here. So all the widgets we routed to, we loaded as screens. We rebuild these widgets whenever anything changes here. If you add a meal as a favorite, or if you change your filters, then the entire app rebuilds, even the parts that are not affected by this. If you, for example, add a meal as a favorite, that doesn't impact your filters, and still that part of the app would also rebuild. So the constant rebuilding of everything is of course not great for performance. You only want to run the build method in the widgets that really depend on the data that changed. And you don't want to rebuild the entire app just because you changed some data which is required in some parts of your app. So that's one annoying part. The other annoying part is what you see down there. We're passing all the data as arguments to our widgets. Here I'm passing the favorite meals to the tabs screen. The tab screen itself does not need the favorite meals. We only need the favorite meals in the tab screen here because we then forward them to the favorites screen. And that's exactly what I also meant. Besides the performance thing and so on, we're forwarding data through widgets. And that means that whenever we add a new widget in between, then we also have to accept the data there and forward it. If we change something, we have to change the arguments we receive. It's really cumbersome to manage this, and it's not really efficient or the way we want to do that. Hence, we need a better way of managing our state. And for that, let me first clarify what state and state management really means. In Flutter applications and in front-end applications in general, it's always about managing data and the user interface that reflects that data. When your data changes, something typically changes on the user interface, because your user interface really just reflects your data in the end. But data is a broad term here. Data can be anything. It can be the products you show in your app. It can be something like, is this product a favorite of the user, or is this user logged in? And it's this data we also refer to as state. State is simply data which affects the user interface and which also might change over time. So something like, are we currently loading new data? Well, if that changes, you probably want to show a loading spinner on the user interface. So that information is also a piece of data that affects your app, your UI, and which therefore would be labeled as state. The user interface in the end is just a function of your data or of your state, which means if your state changes, the user interface changes. Now for state, you have a couple of different kinds of state, and that's not a hard separation you have to learn. It's just helpful for understanding what I mean when I say state. We have application-wide state, and we have widget or local state. Now app-wide state, as the name suggests, affects the entire application, or at least large chunks of the app. And examples here would be the authentication status of a user. Is the user authenticated? If the user is not authenticated, we typically want to show a totally different app. We want to show a login screen instead of our products. But the loaded products themselves could be data that is required in many parts of your app. Maybe not in every part, but you need the loaded products in the products overview, in the product details screen, also maybe in parts of your shopping cart screens. So these are pieces of data which you need in many places of your app or which have an impact on the entire app or on large chunks of the app. And widget or local state, on the other hand, is really just state that affects only a widget on its own and does not affect other widgets. And a typical example here would be a loading spinner. Should I display a loading spinner in this widget? This piece of information does probably not affect any other widget, but it's important for this widget and what you display in there. Or when you manage form input, so text input the user enters. Things like, is the data the user entered valid, or are there errors in the data the user entered? That's really only relevant to this widget because you might want to show an error message there. It's not relevant to a totally different part of your app. So these are roughly the categories of state which you can differentiate, and state in general is really just data in your app, which changes and affects your UI.